Hey, welcome to this week's episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. We are continuing a 4-part series. This is part 3 of a 4-part series on different softwares that you can use for illustrating your quilt pattern. So drawing the diagrams and the actual pictures that go along with the instructions. This episode is a little bit of a deep dive into Affinity Designer, specifically Affinity Designer 2, which is the current version of the software that they have out. The nice thing about Affinity is that there's only a single payment you have to pay. It's not subscription based, so there's not an ongoing fee. You just pay one relatively larger fee and then it's yours forever. But if they update the software, you don't get access to that. But it is a much nicer price point to swallow, especially when it's on sale, than the ongoing subscription of Adobe Illustrator or something similar to that. So this is Affinity Designer 2. This is the workspace that you get when you open it up. You'll see some similarities to Illustrator for sure, and then also quite a few differences. We've got that similar kind of left toolbar that has kind of all of your shape functions, your text functions, shape builder tools, things like that. And then you have what they call the studio on the right side, which is your customizable panel. And we can add different tools to this thing, like your stroke panel, your layers panel, your swatches, color, all of those things will live over here. But unlike Illustrator, they can't kind of expand and collapse to where it's unintrusive to the entire workspace, which is a little bit of a drawback for me because this does take up a lot of space. And if you've got a lot of things open, you have to kind of keep switching between all of these tabs and panels. So my preference is definitely for the Illustrator side panel where you can kind of expand and collapse these things. So it's just kind of a minor bar on the side and you've got this big, nice open workspace to work in. But I don't think it really changes the functionality of the software. It's just kind of a preference for me, probably because I'm used to using Illustrator. That's what I started in. To customize this thing, you can of course just kind of drag and drop these things. They can also just kind of float for you and you can close them out if you need to. So we can relock any of these things by just kind of grabbing them, usually on that little pause icon is where it works best, and push them back in. So there is customization, but it's not as straightforward as it is in Illustrator. There is a little bit of making sure you hover over just the right thing or else it doesn't work. And of course, there's lots of other tools available to you. You just have to come up to Window and open them and then lock them into the toolbar where you want them. And as far as I can tell, these states are saved. When you close out the program and open it again, these states will still be there. So it does save your workspace, which is nice. Now, one thing that I really don't like about Affinity Designer is that there is no way to hide these artboards. So the artboard that you started with or that you set when you open the file, you can't just like hide this thing. And for me, that's annoying because it means that unless I make this thing like massive, like 55 feet wide, I'm going to end up with pieces that are kind of floating in this background. There is a way to kind of update the color of that to kind of give you the feeling of that infinite artboard that like you get in Illustrator, but you can't just Control-Shift-H or hide the artboards like you can in Illustrator, which I really wish there was that feature. Let's talk about another key feature of any kind of graphic software that you might be using for quilt pattern design, and that is the functionality of the shape builder tool. So let's start with just a half square triangle. And again, there's a lot of the same hotkeys. If I hold Shift, I can make that a perfect square. Now, the default settings of Affinity are always to leave you with no stroke, which is a little bit annoying to me because I usually want the stroke there. So we have to first add the stroke, and then the default also gives you a really, really thin stroke versus like a 1-point stroke, which is typical for most other graphics programs. So these are just kind of some little quirks about Affinity Designer that I don't necessarily love. I wish these defaults were a little bit more usable from my standpoint. So if I bump that up, now we've got a stroke of 1. And if I click off of that, we actually can see that shape, but otherwise it would have had no stroke at all. There are probably ways to change that in the preferences, but I haven't dug deep enough into the software to figure out how to do it. And honestly, it's nice to not have to go change your preferences constantly just to get it to behave the way that you want by default. So let's add a line across the diagonal here so that we can go ahead and make our half square triangle. Now, another thing here is that Illustrator will give you both like a straight line tool and then a curved line tool. In Affinity Designer, these are the same tools. So you actually have to go in and select the correct mode before you get started, or else the second you click into this, you're going to start getting like a curvy linear line, which is not helpful at all. So again, just like a little default quirk that you have to get used to, but it does take a hot second to like remember to switch over to that stroke, especially when you're used to something else. So we'll just give ourselves a diagonal just like that. And you can see now that I've updated that stroke kind of default in this file, it is holding that for me. But what I've noticed is that as soon as I close this program back out and start a new file, it's going to revert back to those annoying defaults. So to get this behaving like two triangles instead of a square with a line through it, we need to use our shape builder tool, of course. Affinity Designer does have that feature. That's going to be this icon down here. It's just a shape builder tool. And there are, again, some quirks to this, right? The default function of this is not as seamless as Illustrator. You need to select the way that the shape builder tool is behaving before you start selecting things, or else you can get some weird things happening. So generally, you're going to want the plus function picked. Minus would basically subtract whatever you're going to select. And then the intersection here will basically just hold the intersection and get rid of everything else on the outside of it. So there are some really weird things that can happen here if you just start clicking around, not understanding what you're doing. And it takes a hot second to figure out which mode you want to be functioning in order to get the right shape. So if I have kind of the plus function picked, I usually just want to click on one shape. I don't want to click both of them. So if I just click into one, now we can see that we've got two half square triangles, and I can of course color that one separately and get the actual HST patch that I'm looking for. Now let's try turning this into a split quarter square triangle where we've got kind of one side joined and the other one in quarters. To do that, I'll just need to, again, grab my pen tool. Now, because that was the last mode I used it in, it's going to stay in line mode. But again, if I close the software out and start a new file, it's going to revert back to those defaults. So it's just a little quirk you have to get used to. I'll drop another diagonal, and then we'll come here and highlight everything and grab our shape builder tool again. Now, I still want to be in plus mode, and we can still click and drag to get everything joined up correctly. But again, this is where weird things start to happen if you're not careful. So if I click in and drag, it's going to join that for us. But there are some shapes where if you click in and drag, you're going to get some really weird functions, especially if things are not aligned perfectly. So you just kind of have to be careful with this tool. Now, what's kind of nice, if I go back a couple steps to where we've kind of just got that unsplit still, is that there are some other things that you can do here. So say, for instance, I came in with my shape builder tool and then just kept all of these pieces separate. So now we've got basically 4 quarter triangles. If I then wanted to join these two, we can just select both of those and use the add function. So I don't have to even dip into Shape Builder. It's kind of like a shortcut that just lets you get there. So that is kind of nice at times. I have yet to find this function in Illustrator if it even exists. So having those kind of up in our top toolbar can be really helpful. You can also do all kinds of different things with layers, right? Putting it on different layers and things like that. They have a subtract function, an intersect function, XOR, divide, like all of these different things that are kind of shortcuts for Shape Builder, if you don't want to just kind of work with the Shape Builder tool with all of these extra features that you have to be aware of. In general, I would say Affinity Designer is more so set up for artists, graphic artists, rather than people that are trying to draw technical diagrams. To some degree, Illustrator is like that as well, right? You can have all of these different modes, and some of them are much more geared for this kind of like creative art where you've got curved lines and like almost like cartoon graphics and illustrations like that, rather than technical diagrams that are very geometric. Illustrator, you can swap it over into kind of that automations workflow where it can be very, very technical, but Affinity Designer just isn't quite set up for that. So you've kind of got to work with the interface a little bit and learn the quirks of it in order to get it working for you the way you need it to for quilt pattern diagrams. Now let's talk about color swatches, because that is one of the features that I do really like about Adobe Illustrator. Affinity Designer also has swatches. We can come in here and choose any of these pieces rather than having to like drag around that color wheel. I do have to say, for me at least, this is much more difficult to work with than Illustrator's kind of drag and drop color editor. But the fact that there are swatches makes it really easy, and you have nice and easy access to your stroke color and your fill color without an issue. There are also quite a few kind of preloaded swatch options for you, but they're more geared towards, like I said, digital art rather than like these color palettes that you might use for a quilt like Illustrator had. Still very useful, still very easy. So they're about the same in that respect. One of the other features that's really important for quilt patterns is, of course, the ability to draw lines with arrows so that we can call out dimensions on our diagrams. To do that in Affinity Designer, we always need to just start with a straight line, just like that. And then to add kind of the arrow end caps that we need, all you have to do is select that line and come up here into the stroke properties. And we can basically specify a start and an end marker if we want to. just like that. Now, again, as with Illustrator, some of these things are like really, really far off, right? So right now my arrowheads are like just way too tiny. I can make this like 300%, and that is with respect to the line width, and that'll kind of bump things up for you. So it's fairly easy to get to these things. I do have to say, I had totally forgotten that Illustrator also offers you this kind of like editing option for the arrow end caps, because to be honest, I just copy and paste my arrows from previous quilt pattern diagrams because I'm never starting from scratch. So I'll be honest, I don't actually set up my arrowheads from scratch very often, but Illustrator has this start and end capped stroke editing option as well. If you just click on stroke with that line highlighted near where we picked out the arrows last week. So again, fairly similar into the functionality of these things, but you can pretty easily get a nice double-ended arrow to call out your dimensions on your diagrams. Now, the last thing we need to think about when we're drawing quilt pattern diagrams is the ease of exporting all of these things. Because again, I always like to have these things as self-contained images that I'm adding into my layout software rather than copying and pasting these things as individual shapes and objects where they can get distorted and moved as I'm laying out that quilt pattern. To export, it's fairly straightforward, but again, there's some quirks here that make it a little bit more difficult to deal with than Illustrator. We're just going to highlight everything and come into File, Export. That's going to bring up a panel that looks like this. By default, it's going to want to give you your entire artboard because again, this software is mostly set up for digital artists where they're kind of doing this whole mural on an artboard and then exporting the whole thing. That's not what we're doing. So we've got to kind of change these settings a little bit in order to get it to work for us. So you've got, the option to choose a bunch of different file types, just like in Illustrator. You can choose the resolution that you need if you're going to go with a pixel-based image. But the key thing for us here is that we don't want to select this whole document. We only want the selection only. If you go with selection area, it's basically going to take everything behind it. That's helpful in certain cases when you're dealing with like quilt pattern templates where you have to do an offset. Offsets in Affinity Designer 2 are a little bit strange too because the actual shape that it gives you is still the shape before you offset things. So you end up with a shape that's basically a 1/4 inch smaller on all sides than it actually should be, which does weird things when you try to export. I don't love that feature about Affinity Designer 2, but if you're not doing templates, it's really not an issue. But once you kind of hit this selection only rather than whole document, it will give you kind of zoomed in just on that little piece that you're working with. And we can export this and get a file that we're going to embed into our quilt pattern layout. It's not too bad. There's just a few little quirks. Alrighty, that's kind of the deep dive into Affinity Designer 2. I hope you found that helpful. If you've never done anything with Affinity Designer and you're on the fence about Adobe Illustrator and the price that comes with it, you're not 100% sure that you're going to go all in on designing patterns, or if you're worried about how much money you can actually make in this industry, this is a good option for you because again, it's a single payment. It's relatively cheap, especially if you grab it when it's on sale, usually 2 or 3 times a year. But there are quirks that you have to deal with this software. Different things like some of the default settings, they're not anything that you can't overcome, but it's just little things that'll end up taking you a little bit longer to draw the same pattern as it would in something like Illustrator that's kind of set up for this high throughput professional use. So a really great option if you're looking for something that's not a subscription base and is a lot cheaper than Adobe Illustrator. Alrighty, that's all I've got for you. We will be finishing up this series next week with a deep dive into Inkscape, which is a free graphics program. There's pros and cons to that, so don't get too excited, but we'll be deep diving into that next week, so make sure you come back and check that out. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next week for the final video in this series.